Hello, welcome to One Life Church Explorer Edition. This is Sarah.
And this is Matt.
And at One Life Church, we want to create a space for you to explore the ideas of the Christian faith, some of our beliefs, some of the questions you may have had about what Christians really believe about who Jesus is, the Bible, all of those things in a way that's a little more relatable, a little more comfortable. Let's just be honest that walking into a church service, if that's not something you're used to or haven't been to in a long time, can be a little awkward. Even an online church service might feel awkward. So this is designed for you.
Yeah, and just a reminder, this is not a church service. This is about 22 minutes, which is about the typical time of a normal TV show. Maybe you have some experience with the Christian faith. Most people in the U.S. probably have, but maybe that gives you a base to ask some questions. It also sometimes can add some barriers. I have a friend who's told me a story about the first time he went to a youth group when he was younger, and he was wearing an M&M shirt. The youth pastor gave him such a hard time that he never came back, and he still remembers that today. Those things sit with us. We remember those. Maybe someone that you thought you were supposed to be able to trust broke that trust inside of a church setting or a Christian faith-based setting. And maybe that gives you an opportunity to ask some questions maybe in a safer space. And so One Life Explorer Edition is set up just for you.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to address these questions, we're going to have this content, and we're going to present it in kind of an artful way. We're going to use film, we're going to use dialogue, we're going to use music, we're going to get into those things, and we hope that it's a way that you can kind of interact with it. We don't want this just to be a monologue about the content. We want it to be, like I said, a dialogue. So please take advantage of the chat on the screen. Sign in, say hello. You can even use a fake name if you want to be anonymous. That's totally fine. What's most important is as questions pop up in your mind about this topic, that you ask them. We want to know your questions. This is a safe place to ask any questions that you have. And what we're going to do is we're going to take your questions and we're going to address them in a live Q&A on Facebook after the episode.
Yeah, and the first question that we're going to address today is asking, who is Jesus? Jesus is the founder of the Christian faith, and I think there's some typical questions that people ask when they start thinking about who Jesus is. You know, why do we believe someone who lived 2,000 years ago, and how do we know that the information we have about him is reliable? And ultimately, why do we believe the things that he said?
Right. So we're going to start off with a short film that we created about the person of Jesus, who he is, his influence on all things. And after that, we're going to hear from our lead pastor of One Life Church, Brett Nicholson. He's going to comment a little bit about the film, some of the things we talked about, ask some more questions and interact about those things. And then we're going to take your questions and we're going to jump straight to the live Q&A after that. So let's get into it.
In the Quran, the holy book of the Muslim faith, you can find these words. O Mary, Allah gives you glad tidings of a word from him. His name will be Christ Jesus, the Son of Mary, held in honor in this world and the hereafter, and of those nearest to Allah. Surah 345. Held in high honor in this world. It's arguable that no one who has ever lived has been held in higher honor than Jesus, the Jewish itinerant preacher from Nazareth. Writer and historian H.G. Wells said, I am an historian. I am not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. But how he made his mark on history is probably the greatest thing about him. It wasn't through conquest. It was through his person and the things he taught. Artist Vincent van Gogh wrote about Jesus saying he lived serenely as a greater artist than all other artists, despising marble and clay as well as color, working in living flesh. That is to say, this matchless artist made neither statues nor pictures nor books. He loudly proclaimed that he made living men, immortals. Then there's the words of Albert Einstein, I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene. No man can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates in every word. No myth is filled with such life. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul. Alone in all history, he estimated the greatness of man. Artists, poets, scientists, historians, all from different belief perspectives, captured by the person of Jesus and holding him in high honor. For those who may, along with H.G. Wells, say they are not believers, they can still see the influence, impact, and mystique of Jesus. The influence is all around us, literally all over the world. In fact, it's so common we could easily overlook it because it's part of the backdrop of our daily reality. Consider architecture, from breathtaking cathedrals to simple country gathering places. His name lives on. The Western calendar now uses the term Common Era, but the numbers haven't changed. We all know it comes from the dating of his birth year. He's the subject of nearly countless paintings and sculptures inspired by his person, the stories he told, and the teachings he proclaimed. Then there's the music. It's hard to imagine how many songs he has inspired, and they range in style from Bach saying that he composed to Jesus' glory, to the classic rock of the Doobie Brothers, and to a shout-out by Post Malone. The celebration of his birthday is arguably the most enthusiastically celebrated holiday in the world, and the most widely celebrated. The mode of his death is memorialized everywhere, from cemetery plots to jewelry. He never wrote a book, but his words have spurred on authors of more books than any person who has ever lived. Some of the greatest universities in the world bear his name: Oxford's Christ Church College, or Cambridge's Jesus College, and Harvard University was founded with this stated purpose: let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ. Then there's the scores and scores of charitable, relief, and justice-bearing organizations all over the world who credit their existence to his existence. Ever notice how many hospitals have names associated with him in one form or another? So much of who Jesus is what many of us aspire to be, even apart from belief in God or religion. We want to be strong, compassionate, purposeful, and loving. But without question, Jesus' own worldview was God-centered. He declared that in many different ways and many different times. His entire message centered around viewing God as his Father and being sent by him in order to fulfill a mission in the world. This may be why we feel drawn to him, but also uncomfortable with him. He's the man everyone seems to admire, but most are uncomfortable talking about. He said, "Come to me, you who are burdened and weary, and I will give you rest." He offered forgiveness and kindness to the downtrodden and cast aside. He associated with people he wasn't supposed to. He is heroic in his mercy. But he is also, as writer C.S. Lewis said it, intolerable in his severity. Jesus pronounced hard-hitting judgments on whole villages. He held out the possibility that you could lose your soul. Jesus is such a powerful and towering figure, it's reasonable to ask the question, who is Jesus, when we assess our view of the world? Should we be content to admire him from a distance? Or do we dare to take the chance, draw close, and let him speak to the most important and meaningful questions of life?
You know, for all the reasons that film just named, we could say this at least, that Jesus is worthy of exploration. I mean, impact on the world that's a little bit hard to describe. And I love the fact that an historian, a scientist, an artist, a poet, even another religion, after looking at him, at least said positive things about him. And so it's a worthwhile question to ask, who is this person and how should he impact my life? If that film got your wheels turning in your mind, and you're open-minded and you're willing to explore, let me give you a suggestion about how to go about this. I invite you to go to the Bible and look at one of the Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were essentially the biographies of Jesus. And read there, and don't read those books like they're in the Bible. That's kind of a weird thing to say, but here's what I mean by that. When you look to the Bible, sometimes I think people bring baggage to it, like this is a religious book and I need to read it like a religious book, and whatever that happens to mean, even in your subconscious. I would encourage you to read it just like you would read any book. Read one of those Gospels of Jesus. Imagine if you wanted to learn about, say, Plato or someone like that. Well, you would go and you listen to other people and what they had to say about Plato, but what you would want to do is read the works of Plato itself, and you would just read it as history and then make up your own mind about it. Now, another reason it's so important to go to the Gospels themselves is all those quotes that were in that film, they're reacting to the character that's presented in those Gospels. That's the one that has impacted history, that portrait. And so you want to know that portrait for yourself. Now, as soon as I say that, though, I've heard kind of cycling around in our culture, there's a kind of doubt that's very popular. Heard Bill Maher on his talk show say this before, that, okay, what the Gospels are in the Bible, they're a long time away from the actual real Jesus. In other words, Jesus is way back there in history, and 30, 40 years ago, these Gospels were written down. So what we're getting there is the legendary version of Jesus, not the actual real Jesus. Well, I can say with a lot of confidence that that's a popular notion, it's a cultural notion, but it's not a scholarly notion. As a matter of fact, we want to pass on some resources to you and encourage you to look at those. For instance, a man by the name of Daniel Wallace is considered an expert on these kinds of issues. Look at his material, and what you'll find out is he can coach you through that that's not a very good way of looking at things. But before you go to those resources, I've read a number of them and listened to these things through the years and thought about them, and I'm hoping to give you just a little bit of confidence that when you go to those Gospels, you're reading the actual real story of the actual real Jesus. The first one is this. Even 30 years is not that long ago. It's not that long ago. Okay, in the coming weeks, you'll hear me say this more and more, that I'm old enough to remember that line. I've passed 50 a few years back, and so I'm old enough to remember. And one of the things that being past 50 does for you is that it gives you a different perspective on time. For instance, if you tell a 3-year-old, hey, we're going to do something in an hour, well, you might as well have told them we're going to do something in a day, because their concept of time is so spread out. Whereas you tell someone like me you're going to do something in an hour, it feels very, very quick. And that's what happens the older you get. Time kind of compresses. And what I can say confidently is 30 years is really not that long. For instance, one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke, and it's not even considered the oldest, was written, most scholars believe, it was probably written in the year 60 to 62 AD. Well, Jesus, history records, it was probably died around the year 33. So backing that up, you're looking at about 27 to 30 years from the time that Jesus was crucified to the time that these records were written down. Well, 27 years ago, it's in 2020, that backs us up to 1993. Now, if you're old enough, maybe you have memories from 1993. I have a memory from 1993. It was the birth of my first child. My daughter was born, and the thing about it is with that memory, even though it was 27 years ago, I can tell you where I stood in the room. I can tell you the kind of discussions that we had. I can tell you what it was like for me, my view from when she first was born, and how I walked around the bed and went over and looked down on her. I can tell you the emotions that I felt. Now, the reason for that is first, I did experience emotions. It was one of the most significant moments in my life. But not only that, I've told that story a number of times. I've had that memory ever since then. I almost can't get it out of my mind. So you have memories like that too. I'm sure you do in your life. Think of something that happened a while back that just marked you and was there. Now, here's the other thing. As families, you probably have stories that you've told. You go through an event or something on vacation, and you have an emotional response to something, or something's funny. Well, you retell the story over and over and over and over again. Well, that's how Jesus' followers would have been originally. They walked around with this remarkable person, seeing remarkable things, having emotional responses to things, and not stopping there. They would have talked about it and interacted about it through the years. Think about this. Back in 26 years ago, 1994, Kurt Cobain passed away. Well, the people that know him or that knew him at that time, they would still tell the story. There are a lot of people alive that do remember him. And if someone were to release a biography about him that would just told a bunch of lies or kind of grew his legend, well, the people around him would be able to say, that's not true at all, because it's really not that far back. Now, combine that not that far back thing with another thing that's very important to remember about Jesus' culture. You see, it was in the 19th and 20th century, in scholarly circles, it was kind of in vogue to explain Jesus by this legendary development thing. But back in the 1990s, there was a group of Jewish scholars who said, you know what, you guys, that's not true. Jesus was obviously a Jewish rabbi. And what we know about Jewish rabbis from history is that they had a way of doing things. They coached their disciples. They would be followed by disciples. Disciples were considered apprentices, and disciples were expected to do a couple things. Number one, imitate the rabbi that they were following, and number two, memorize their words. You see, they lived in a memorization culture, and so they were very good at this. Here it comes, I'm old enough to remember, maybe some of you are as well, but I'm old enough to remember when the phone in the house was attached to the wall and you had a cord. And during that time too, I remember knowing quite a few people's phone numbers, maybe 10 or a dozen or something like that. Numbers I had memorized. You know how many phone numbers I have memorized now? 2, maybe. I have mine and my wife's, no others. Why is that? Because I don't need to do that anymore. My phone can do that for me. Well, back then, it was very expensive. It was kind of an arduous process to get things in writing. So they didn't sit around and wanting to learn going, man, I wish somebody would invent books someday. They would just download information differently. They would store it all in their minds. They would memorize things. There's stories, if it wasn't that unusual for a young Jewish person to have the entire first 5 books of the Bible memorized. Get out a Bible sometime and look at the first 5 books and think about how much material was there. It was not unusual at all to have that much stuff memorized. That's just kind of how they learned. That's how they thought. And then if you read Jesus' words, when you go to the Gospels, what you'll notice is he did what all rabbis did. He constructed what he said in a way that was easy to memorize. He had little sayings, like one of them was, many who were first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Well, that's obviously fairly easy to remember. If you ask many people out there, they could probably tell you the basics of the story of the Good Samaritan. It's even known in our culture. Well, why has it been remembered throughout centuries? Because it's a story, and stories stick. And Jesus told a lot of stories, he had a lot of sayings, and he was an itinerant preacher. And what that meant was he traveled from town to town, and his disciples followed him everywhere. And he would have given the same speech over and over and over and over again. And in the times in between, if you were a good disciple, you would want to impress Jesus by being able to recite back to him what he said from memory. It was kind of a test. Now, the reason I say all of that is just to let you know that if you go to one of these Gospels, you can be confident that you're getting the actual, real Jesus. You're getting an accurate report of who he was and what he said. And with that confidence that you're willing to explore with, hopefully you can make up your mind for yourself about who he is and what he's about and what maybe claims that he has on your life. Check it out for yourself and explore.
Thank you for joining us, and we want to invite you to join us again next week as we continue another question and conversation about the nature of beliefs. So make sure you just come back to this place here.
Yeah, and thank you so much for interacting in the chat. Thank you for all your questions. What we're going to do now is there is a link in the chat. Go ahead and click that. That will take you straight to our Facebook Live Q&A. And so thank you so much again, and we'll see you next week.